We are here with Zack Beauchamp. Zack is a senior correspondent at Vox. He has appeared on a wide range of television and radio networks, including MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, BBC, CBC, ABC Australia, and Al Jazeera.
Good to see you.
We just kind of wanted to give our listeners a sense of where things stand right now.
There are active negotiations right now concerning the nature of an upcoming long-range ceasefire. Not an indefinite ceasefire. We're talking about like over a month, maybe 6 weeks or so, which I believe the Biden administration hopes could lay the groundwork for a permanent ceasefire. Those negotiations are stymied. The big thing that everyone on the ground is watching for is a potential Israeli incursion into Rafah. Rafah is in western Gaza, and it is where about 1 million Palestinians, which is roughly half the population of the Gaza Strip, are holed up after they've been told to evacuate everywhere else. Any Israeli operation there would be unbelievably devastating. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is an absolute nightmare. You're seeing reports of children starving to death because of insufficient food coming into the Strip. Hamas has been significantly degraded militarily, but is not on the brink of being destroyed. They're still quite operative, and their top-level leadership is still at large. And the Israeli government is also teetering on a brink right now. There are deep divisions. Netanyahu, he's very, very unpopular. If his government were to collapse, then there'd be new elections and he would lose, without a doubt.
With everything that's happening now, would you say Israel is safer coming out of this war?
The answer I will give you is probably no. So if you listen to the Israeli Defense Forces and their supporters abroad, the argument they make is we've done extraordinary amounts of damage to Hamas's military capabilities. That is true, right? The ability for Hamas to launch anything like the October 7th attacks in the near future, very, very depleted. But we don't just care about immediate short-term safety, right? Like what really matters for Israel is a long-term situation where they don't have to worry about this repeating itself again. And to do that, you need to deal with the foundations of Hamas political power. What kind of post-war plan would look like to prevent them either from simply just reinstating their government in Gaza or from mounting an insurgency that makes them even more popular. You have to worry about the fact that Hamas popularity is spiking in the West Bank due to anger at Israel and alleged complicity of the Palestinian Authority led by the moderate Fatah party in what Palestinians see as an Israeli genocide in Gaza. That all creates a recipe for long-term instability. It's very hard to imagine living in peace next to people who, if you're Palestinian, you believe just tried to destroy a significant portion of your nationhood, right, entirely. And so the long-term foundations for peaceful coexistence and for preventing a recurrence of hostilities in the future, those aren't being laid at all. In fact, they're getting worse.
After the October 7th attacks, you wrote a piece about another path that Israel could have taken. Can you sort of talk a bit about that piece?
This is one of those times where you're really unhappy to have been right. What is happening to Palestinian civilians is unspeakable. And the fact that it's being done for very little in terms of long-term strategic gains for Israel, and in fact, in some ways is setting Israel's long-term security back, is appalling. Right? The conclusions that I drew were two things. One is that any kind of attempt to collectively punish the civilians of Gaza would be counterproductive, not to mention a moral atrocity, indefensible. And second, that trying to destroy Hamas would be likely to draw Israel into a long-term conflict that it had no good exit strategy for, and would either fail or draw them into a disastrous occupation of the Gaza Strip for an extended period of time. And right now, both of those outcomes are looking as likely as they did then. The post-war plan, it's not really a plan, but that was unveiled by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently, basically is a recipe for a long-term Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip, which, if you remember anything about recent military occupations of countries by hostile invading forces, that doesn't tend to work out very well. There are two ways that occupying powers win when they fight insurgencies. Either they turn the population against them, or they just kill people indiscriminately until everyone is too afraid to fight back. And one of those is impossible. And the other one is a moral atrocity on a scale that's unimaginable. And I don't think even Israel, and sort of the pain and the hurt and the anger and the terror that Israeli civilians feel after October 7th, I don't think they could even countenance the scale of killing that would be necessary to do that kind of counterinsurgency. That's saying a lot given what's happening right now. So I'm trying to outline how much worse it could get. There was an alternative, I argued at the time, that Israel could attempt to engage in a targeted counterterrorism operation designed to accomplish short-term security, to degrade Hamas significantly, maybe kill and capture some of the leaders responsible for what happened, while at the same time negotiating to bring its hostages back and to lay the groundwork for a long-term peaceful solution by taking steps towards improving the lot of Palestinians in the West Bank in particular. They have not done that, right? But a different government still could. The thing that I think I got wrong is that I underestimated the degree to which there would be international will to support a post-war reality in Gaza. And so if the Israeli government were to pivot strongly to, we're going to allow the Palestinian Authority to come in with backing from the United States, surrounding Arab countries and Europe, and try to make the post-war situation conducive to a two-state reality in the future, they could still execute on that.
Abbas recently tendered the resignation of his prime minister. What do you think the significance of that move is?
Part of me wants to say it's like a sort of deck chairs on the Titanic situation. Prime ministers are not important compared to the power of the president, who is, for all intents and purposes, a dictator in the West Bank. The PA is extremely corrupt. It's widely viewed with suspicion due to security cooperation with Israel. So the thing would be to get meaningful concessions out of Israel, right? If Israel wants to do something about protecting its long-term security interests, the thing to do is to do everything you can to improve the Palestinian Authority, to make it seem like a peaceful solution to the conflict will better serve Palestinian national interests. The problem is just that the current Israeli government is not capable of doing that.
And speaking of the current government in Israel, what's been consistent about Netanyahu's politics over the years, and what makes this particular coalition he's overseeing different?
So in the stretch between 2009 and today, there are two things that I think are very clear about Netanyahu's leadership. He has become increasingly authoritarian in the way that he's related to Israeli democracy, and his governments have become increasingly dependent on the support of right-wing and arguably outright fascist parties. So his current government is made up of the Likud, which for a long time was the center-right Israeli party, but now under Netanyahu is really a kind of form of far-right politics. Then there's the religious Zionism slate, which is really made up of religious Zionism, the party, and Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power, which is the aforementioned fascist party I've talked about. Ideologically, the descendant of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was an out-and-out Jewish supremacist, which is a phrase I'm uncomfortable with as a Jew, but it is accurate to describe what his politics really are. And then there's the ultra-Orthodox parties. Those parties have drifted to the right too on the conflict. And Netanyahu is also at the same time facing trial on corruption charges. The most serious of these charges is basically that he wanted to exchange regulatory favors with a media company in exchange for favorable coverage. And so the Israeli legal system is going after him. And so his primary political priority is staying in power so he can use the law to make sure he never has to face these charges.
What is Netanyahu's orientation towards the rest of the world? How is that different from previous Israeli leaders?
For a long time, Israel, I would say, aspired to be a Western nation, right? They saw themselves as a democracy that was essential to their self-identity. They participate in Eurovision, right? It speaks to sort of the aspirations of the Israeli people. And geopolitically, they've really been aligned with the NATO bloc. Netanyahu has cultivated a very different approach to world politics. He has aligned himself with the emerging populist right. He's long been friends with Viktor Orban. Netanyahu had an American campaign consultant, this guy's named Arthur Finkelstein, who he recommended to Orban. And Arthur Finkelstein is the guy who came up with the campaign tactic of attacking George Soros, which then spread later to the US.
I just have to say, I did not know at all that Netanyahu in some way was the origin of the largest anti-Semitic myth.
Indirect, but wild, yeah.
And the fact that, I mean, I don't know anything about Arthur Finkelstein, but I will use my heritage to make a guess.
You would be correct. You would be correct, yes.
Netanyahu's orientation towards the world definitely presents a problem for Eurovision and other more maybe serious international institutions. But, you sort of see, I think, international institutions with this war taking a kind of stronger line, against Israel. You mentioned earlier this International Court of Justice case that South Africa has brought. I think when I first heard about this, I thought this is really just going to cause Israelis to retreat further from this sort of internationalist project. But you also mentioned Aharon Barak earlier and his selection as a sort of ad hoc judge at the ICJ. Obviously, like Netanyahu's government doesn't love Aharon Barak.
No, the opposite. They villainize him constantly.
Yeah, so it's like, it felt like taking the charge seriously at the ICJ. I guess, can you talk about like these international institutions that constantly find themselves torn between, I guess, the sort of hug BB strategy and the sanction Israel. Do you see anything as being effective with this current government?
It's very, very difficult, right? The only actor, I think, with significant leverage is the United States, because Israel depends so much on American military aid and diplomatic aid. And also politically, Joe Biden is incredibly popular in Israel. Biden personally, just going and speaking to Israelis, would have a tremendous amount of leverage over Netanyahu. She's chosen not to do for reasons that kind of baffle me, honestly. I don't know what they're thinking. Yeah. But I want to talk about it not necessarily from the point of view of like what is likely to change Israeli behavior, but what are the obligations of these international organizations? Like I was talking about this when I told my wife this morning I was going to do a Eurovision podcast. She's a sports scholar by training, so she thinks about this through the lens of the Olympics. Well, in the Olympics case, a lot of the claim that I think is morally defensible is that there's a hypocrisy element. Right? If China is allowed to participate, why does Israel get singled out? But in the context of Eurovision, she pointed out, I want to credit her for all of this because her smart thoughts, not mine. Yeah. Does Eurovision have a different set of moral responsibilities than, say, the IOC when it comes to permitting countries that are committing clear atrocities, which I think Israel is? And more broadly, do you think about it through the lens of what extent are you participating in a long-range movement to protect and defend the liberal international order as we understand it, one that takes human rights claims seriously regardless of who the victims are? And I think that's a very potent challenge. Part of the reason I'm here, right, is that I love Eurovision from my time living in Europe. I have a strong, just as somebody who is Jewish, right, a strong sense of pride when Israel won a few years ago, for all of the problems I have with the Israeli state, for all I don't identify with leadership and oppose them and constantly write critical articles about them, there's something very meaningful to me about their ability to have accomplishments then that speak to a sense of pride in Jews being counted among the nations. And so it makes me loath to say Israel should be kicked out of Eurovision, or there should even be a conversation about it. But at the same time, I mean, what they're doing to Palestinians is totally unconscionable, absolutely indefensible, the way that the war is being prosecuted right now. I do believe strongly that Israel has a strong rationale to exist on the grounds of being a place to protect Jews internationally. And the spate of anti-Semitism that we've seen internationally after the October 7th attacks prove that, right? It's a profoundly difficult way of emotionally identifying, where I have family there, I care about their welfare, but I also know Palestinians there and I care about what happens to them too, even though they're not my blood relations, right? They're human beings who are moral equals to all the Jews living in Israel. So how to balance my sociocultural and ideological affection for the idea of a Jewish state with the reality of one that has in so many ways violated other people's rights while claiming to defend mine and not really doing so. West Bank settlement doesn't help me at all, right? If anything, it makes me more vulnerable. I'm implicated and affected by these policies. I realize I'm just laying out a series of different complicating factors that explain why it's so hard to be somebody who cares about both universal moral values and the safety and security of specific people.
You're kind of a great person to talk to on this, also because of your expertise in Hungary and this idea of what's going on in Israel and the corollaries to Orban's Hungary, particularly in how those two countries occupy space on the international stage these days.
Well, for more of this comparison, you should read my forthcoming book, The Reactionary Spirit, which is all about comparisons of cross-national authoritarianism in what were previously stable democracies. There's chapters on Israel and Hungary.
A pre-order link?
Yes, yeah, I'll send it to you. But look, I think the EU has been unconscionably late on Hungary. And now recently it started taking real action, right? The suspension of EU funding for Hungary is a significant blow to the Orban regime. That's something they should have done a long time ago. That's the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear by linkage to other countries, right? Being part of the European Union makes Hungary dependent on other EU countries in a lot of different ways and gives them significant forms of leverage over Hungary. Israel, not part of the European Union, doesn't have those same kind of interconnections. There are cultural ties and some economic ties. They could potentially be levers. But again, right, the real stick here, like the EU is for Hungary, is the United States, right? What they can't deal with is a severing of the relationship with the United States, because that could make the international institutions much more powerful, right? If the US stops vetoing resolutions in the UN Security Council, that creates huge problems for Israel.
Moving a little bit to this piece you wrote about liberal Zionism, there does seem to be this inherent tension in liberal Zionism. We're talking about the idea of a liberal state and the idea of a state that in some way is elevating one religion or group. So can you just talk a little bit about what liberal Zionism is?
The way I think about it that was best described is from a former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aharon Barak. Barak defined his vision of what it meant to be a Jewish and democratic state as a state that had, one, Jewish national symbols and identifiers. So Jewish holidays or national holidays that use the Star of David as the flag. Hebrew as the national language. And second, Jews abroad who might have been in trouble or in danger, they could always come to Israel if they wanted to. And for him, that was it. That vision of what it means to be a Jewish state is not a religious state at all. It wouldn't really make it that different from Germany, which has preferential immigration for ethnic Germans, basically the Jewish version of a European democracy. And so there's a reason why, first and foremost, liberal Zionism as a movement, or those who can be identified with it, cared about a two-state solution to the conflict. Because the only conditions under which you could have this culturally secular Jewish state is one in which there's a Jewish majority, and one in which that Jewish majority was not presiding over an undemocratic and brutal, vicious occupation of a non-Jewish population. That was entirely inconsistent with the ideas of universal equality that Barak describes. And that entails a whole lot of values that the Israeli state currently and probably never has lived up to. The question is how much closer you bring it to its ideals.
Specifically, what in the October 7th attacks and everything that's happened since makes you feel like there's an opening?
There's historical precedence for this, right? Like after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, just a few years later, Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt. And that seemed like it would have been unthinkable when they were just at war. The second thing is that the left has an incredibly strong case that the far right is responsible for what happened on October 7th, right? Because so much of the Israeli military, the active duty military, was deployed in the West Bank trying to deal with problems created by extremist settlers who often require Israeli military protection. Oftentimes the military assists them in going on violent rampages. That meant that the actual security interests of most Israelis, right, not to be invaded and massacred, were being neglected. It's bizarrely easy to forget, but for the most of 2023, Israel had the largest protest in its history against Netanyahu's attempt to suborn the judiciary. And so the challenge for the peace camp is to create linkages between this domestic concern and the Palestinian policy of the Netanyahu government. There are some quiet indicators in the polls that Israelis are shifting in a liberal direction, right? There's a poll that showed the Israeli public turning against what's called the nation-state law, which is the equivalent of a constitutional amendment defining Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. In actuality, it, for a variety of reasons, slots Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israelis, depending on whose terminology you like, into a second-class citizenship, right? One with formally weaker access to the state's legal institutions. And people have turned against it. They've developed a sense that Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, again, the terminology is loaded, like whichever term you prefer, have participated in dealing with the humanitarian crisis created by October 7th, have been part of the same polity that was attacked, and a real sense of egalitarian nationhood inside Israel has been strengthened.
This has been a great conversation, and thank you so much.
All the mysteries of the Euroverse.